And we are rolling. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Mark.
This is Mark Goldberg with the UN and Global Affairs blog, UN Dispatch, speaking to lawyers, guns, and money blogger Charli Carpenter. I got to say, that's my favorite name of a blog out there.
Oh, fabulous. We like it as well.
Maybe I'm just a Warren Zevon fan, but I do like it. I know that Robert Farley is a sometime blogging head as well.
Yes.
So this is your inaugural appearance on Blogging Heads on UN Plaza, this program in particular. I guess maybe by way of introduction, you can, because you're affiliated, you're a university professor. Maybe you can kind of explain sort of how you fit into this universe, what it is you research and do, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Yeah, well, I'm trained as a political scientist, and I'm based at the Political Science Department at University of Massachusetts-Amherst, but I describe myself as a human security analyst, which means I write and teach and blog about the intersection between human rights, military affairs, and humanitarian law, both at Lawyers, Guns, and Money, but also at Duck of Minerva and Current Intelligence, in fact. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, it means I'm looking at security policy not from the perspective of how to protect state institutions or territorial borders, but rather how well our security policies are working to protect individuals, particularly civilians. So the assumption that I bring to my work is that a well-run security sector is indispensable to the promotion of human rights, but that we can't take that for granted. And so I'm studying all of the different social currents, both within the defense establishment and also outside of it in global civil society, that are aimed at bringing security policy more in line with human rights law.
Now, as sort of a academic field, this idea of human security sort of is a post-Cold War institution, is it not? I remember reading an article, I believe by Jessica Matthews, that was sort of kind of laid the groundwork for this, right? The sort of paradigm shift in security.
Yeah, Jessica's work was very focused on the NGO sector and how global civil society could teach the state system new norms and bring those ideologies to bear. But I think that the concept of human security is older than that article. It goes back to, it's a creature of the UN, in fact. Boutros Ghali came up with this in his original Agenda for Peace, back right at the end of the Cold War, as you say. And I think that if you think of human security broadly, as I do, it actually predates the creation of the term. I mean, governments for a very long time, since back in the 19th century, have cared very deeply about humanitarian law, sort of rules that guide the conduct of militaries in the field. Humanitarian intervention is an old concept, even though the idea that it's legitimate in certain cases is new. So it really depends on how you define human security, and in the academy there's a lot of debate about what the term even means. Should it be, is human security about securing civilians from bodily integrity violations by their states, by their governments, or is it also about economic security, food security, the freedom from want side of it? So academics take different perspectives on this. So do governments. It's a big schism between Canada and Japan, for example. The Canadian approach to human security, very focused on genocide prevention, among other things. For the Japanese, they would focus much more on poverty reduction. And so, one question I have for you is whether this term has sort of fallen out of favor in UN circles. It seems to me, as an outsider, that it has, and you're following some of what's going on at the UN much more closely than I am on a regular basis. So I wonder if it's sort of fallen by the wayside. If so, why? And if so, is it making a comeback or likely to do so?
Well, I mean, it seems like on like an operational level, the opportunities to sort of promote human security probably manifest themselves most clearly in UN peacekeeping. And as you know, in the 1990s, there was a sort of disaster of UN peacekeeping in Bosnia and in Rwanda, and then around in the year 2000, the UN released this kind of landmark report by Lakhdar Brahimi, called the Brahimi Report, which sort of took a look at past failures and sort of set sort of new guidelines for how to approach peacekeeping in the future. And sort of since then, the UN had racked up, a series of successes in peacekeeping, particularly in West Africa, in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And now, sort of the big question on people's minds is sort of how to do civilian protection better. Last week or 2 weeks ago on Blogging Heads, I talked to an advocate from Refugees International who just put out a report on how the UN can do civilian protection better, how they can sort of what they can do, how they can adjust peacekeeping mandates, how they can just do a better job of keeping civilians out of harm's way. And the UN itself has also put out a report last year called New Horizons or something like that. That it was a report of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, specifically looking at how to protect people better. And the big problem, the big problem is the expectations on the ground is that peacekeepers will protect civilians. Oftentimes, however, peacekeepers don't have the equipment, the wherewithal, or the numbers to effectively do that. So it's sort of like we're in a bind at the moment. But there does seem to be a greater focus on peacekeeping from member states right now, more than there really has been in a long time. I think mostly because the new U.S. ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, has sort of identified it as one of her top priorities to shore up peacekeeping. So I think there is some movement there. But, we'll just sort of have to wait and see, I think.
Yeah. And my understanding is that OCHA is trying to create a new report on the concept of human security and try to recreate some of the consensus that was lost about what it means in the broader UN context and with member states as well. I don't know much beyond that. Do you have any insight into that
I don't.
process?
For the record, OCHA is the humanitarian Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It's sort of the group that coordinates humanitarian relief and response to things like Haiti. But maybe one interesting way of looking at this is looking at Somalia, which is kind of popped up into the news this week because of a report that the Security Council authorized these investigators to go check out Somalia, look at things like, is arms smuggling going on? What's the state of play with the sort of with the insurgent movements? What is the international community doing to help the situation? And what's going on with piracy there? It was a pretty wide-ranging report that offered that offered a really sort of spotlight onto a lot of uncomfortable issues for the UN in many ways. One of the headlines to come out of this report was that the World Food Program was allegedly diverting some of its food aid to insurgents, or to put it maybe more accurately, sort of aid was leaking to groups that were opposed to the government, like Al-Shabaab and all that. And I was wondering, so you had a chance to read the report. I was wondering sort of what your thoughts were on it in general and on this World Food Program issue more specifically.
As I read the report, my initial reaction, and also the news coverage of it, my reaction is, what's the fuss, right? I mean, is this not par for the course in any humanitarian context where you need to get aid to civilians or hungry people? But in order to get access to them, you need to work with the authorities that exercise control over the territories in which they're embedded. And in parts of Somalia, quite frankly, that's not the central government. That is, or the official government. It is militias. It is groups like Al-Shabaab in the south. And so it strikes me that there's nothing so strange here or so unexpected. I mean, this is the same thing that aid workers had to do in Bosnia to get food to Bosnian Serb or Bosnian Muslim civilians. In Sudan, you have to work with the government to get aid to Darfur. So I guess my question, what do you think? Why now would the United Nations be sort of zero in on World Food Program for doing exactly the same thing that is one of the cornerstone dilemmas of humanitarian aid work in general?
Right. I think what this report does is sort of highlight a key tension in a lot of the delivery of humanitarian aid, but also a key tension in Somalia, specifically. So the UN has a political agenda in Somalia, and that is to prop up the transitional government of Somalia. And, they have a political office for Somalia that I think is based actually in Kenya because of the security situation. There's an African Union peacekeeping force in Mogadishu that's basically keeping the transitional government up and running, is providing security for them. And so, the goal from a political and economic development side is to do what you can to strengthen the government. Now, the World Food Program is an apolitical organization. They have a single goal, and that's humanitarian. They just want to deliver food to needy people. At times, as you can see, at times, if that humanitarian goal conflicts with the political goal, then, so be it. For example, I've heard stories that the World Food Program, in order to more expeditiously get food to, the areas of Sudan controlled by al-Shabaab, where a lot of hungry people are, they would bypass the port of Mogadishu. The problem is the port of Mogadishu is controlled by the, transitional federal government, and, they want to be, the conduit for aid. But the World Food Program says, our goal is not to prop you up. Our goal is to feed hungry people. And unfortunately, as you said, that sometimes includes dealing with unsavory characters. I think there are, maybe moral and political compromises to be made on both sides. It's not a clear-cut one is better than the other because, in the end, in the long term, Somalia will only recover if its political institutions, are strong enough to take care of its own people. So I think there are certainly two sides of this coin, and it's a pretty complex issue, I think.
Mark, so what do you make of the Security Council's response to all this, right? They basically responded by establishing another fact-finding mission, this one more independent, so we're going to get another investigation and another report. And I just wonder, what that is going to tell us about this that we don't now know, or if that's anything other than an attempt to appear to be doing something while basically...
Well, I mean, if you look at how certain members of the Security Council have responded to this, the World Food Program sort of allegations, they have, it seems that the Security Council is invested in the political side of things. They want to prop up the government, so they see this aid leakage as problematic to their long-term goals, and you can see that the U.S. cut its World Food Program aid to Somalia, over this reason. They don't want to be seen as, aiding insurgents. So I think it seems that the Security Council comes firmly down on the political sort of question.
I actually, when I read the report, it struck me how small a piece of it this particular issue is, and yet how it's the one piece that the media has seized upon and that the Security Council is talking about publicly. And I think the much bigger issue raised in the report is really whether continued Western support for the transitional federal government is sustainable, considering how weak it is, how it's considered to be quite illegitimate by many of the people in Somalia, and that its existence and sort of being seen as dominated by foreigners is actually providing an excuse for these disparate groups to have a lot more cohesion than they otherwise would. I wonder if the aid issue, I don't know if you know anything about how the aid issue was leaked to the New York Times last week, but do you think there's some effort perhaps to try to put the spotlight on that so as to draw attention away from some of the more radical implications that you could read into that assessment?
I don't know how this was leaked. I mean, this was with the Security Council before. This had been circulating, around the Security Council. I think that the date on the report was, I think, a day before the New York Times report on the report, if that makes sense. So, perhaps it was leaked from a member of the Security Council. And in my experience, at the, reporting on the UN, it's usually member states that are most willing to leak these documents than the secretary, the General Secretariat itself. But, who knows? I couldn't speculate, but it seems that, you have one member state in particular, the United States, who who again had suspended their aid, who had announced that they were suspending aid a couple weeks before this report came out. So maybe this report justifies their decision to suspend aid. But in terms of larger implications, yeah, I mean, it's the problem is, other than supporting this weak government, sort of what other options are there?
There are other options. I mean, this Council on Foreign Relations just released a report also this month on Somalia, suggesting, I mean, it's very tailored to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, but you could read the same implications in for the entire international community. I mean, one option is to continue supporting an illegitimate and ineffective government. Another option would be to sort of stop doing that and, say, adopt a position of neutrality, which is what the CFR report describes as constructive disengagement, right? Where you say, we're going to support whoever wins, whoever gains enough popular support and legitimacy to take control at some level, as long as they do not do incursions into Somaliland and Puntland, and as long as they do not continue to engage with Al-Qaeda, right? So basically, simply take the position that as long as you exert some control within your borders, we're not going to go crazy over whether you're an Islamist government or a secular government. We're not going to pick sides. And if you do that, then you essentially take the foreigners out of the equation. You allow the groups that are on the ground to begin to fragment, which they will, arguably. And one suggestion from the report is that you begin to think of the TFG more as a body for bringing these groups together for dialogue, rather than a central government that's going to try to exert sovereign control over territories, which is very threatening to some of the other power centers in the country. So almost more of a UN model, right, for a situation that is essentially anarchic, much the way the international state system is, where the UN, by not trying to be a world government, by positioning itself as a forum for dialogue, is actually able to exert a great amount of governance over the international system without threatening member states. So the report suggests that there actually are other options for the West that perhaps might be more effective in the long term, even if they're not going to produce the Somalia that we might like to see.
It's funny because it seems like that sort of would have worked 3 or 4 years ago,
yeah,
right? When the Islamic Course Union took over Somalia and Ethiopia, backed by U.S. air power, invaded because they didn't like that government, even though that government apparently had brought a semblance of stability and security to the country that it hadn't experienced in a long time.
And it was
then
enormously
after
popular.
the Ethiopians invaded, backed by U.S. air power, there was an insurgency erupted, and that gave rise to Al-Shabaab, which is on the ascendance right now. So it seems like that would have been a good idea a few years ago.
Yeah.
So let's see. Have we exhausted Somalia? Do you want to move on? So you had some.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the
ideas.
Piracy piece of the report.
Pirates. You love. We actually both wrote pretty much the exact same blog post, which wasn't really much of a post so much as it was copying and pasting a fascinating snippet in the report, which is really only a couple hundred words long. But I'll let you summarize what we both did.
Well, it's the Pirates business model piece on page 99, where the report basically describes the pirate industry as essentially a capitalist enterprise where locals can invest in pirate operations for a share of the take, and it's really fueled the economy there in ways that have been much more lucrative for local civilians as well as sort of these maritime brigands, and has reliance on humanitarian aid, frankly. So it's, I don't know, I think there's some interesting conclusions you could draw from that, but certainly it might be useful to think of piracy as part of the informal economy and think about ways to deal with it through a political economy model.
Mm-hmm. No, agreed. And, I guess what I thought, when you say pirates, people, tend to think of this ragtag band of, swashbuckling sailors. But what this, short, it was really in the annex of the report, sort of described was a very, complex business model where people are apportioned shares of the profit. And there's, minus, the overhead costs and all that, and they're distributed among, people based on a predetermined formula. And it was just an interesting, I think, insight into, like, as you said, the business model of how this this one important part of the informal economy.
Yeah, I mean, Somalis. I think the report gets the tone right. I mean, sometimes there's some hysteria in the press and in analytical reports about piracy driving the humanitarian crisis or political crisis, and I think the report makes it clear that piracy is a symptom, not a driver. And Somalis tend to see the pirate economy as a very small part of the broader political and humanitarian crisis. So in some places, pirates are seen as a bad influence, but in other places, they're just seen as legitimate businessmen or stable future husbands for daughters and even lucrative investments for locals. There's this great story I heard on a conference panel at the International Studies Association this year about a divorcee in Somalia who received her husband's rocket-propelled grenade as part of her divorce settlement. So she loaned it to a maritime militia in exchange for a share of the booty, and when they took a ship and got the ransom, she was able to turn $75,000 on her investment. So when you consider that the alternative for locals is often unemployment or agricultural sector in which they have to compete with the aid community or dependency on foreign handouts themselves, which a lot of it is being siphoned off by warlords, right? It's hard to make the argument that the pirate economy is necessarily bad for human security, especially since Somali pirates, at least though not in some other parts of the world, Somali pirates tend to treat their captives quite humanely. There aren't a lot of deaths, and it's basically a way they see themselves as sort of local Robin Hood characters, where they're trying to extract back from the global capitalist system some revenue, given that they've lost their livelihoods due to illegal overfishing and the failure of the international community to enforce environmental regulations around their borders.
Okay, sorry about that brief interruption.
Not at all.
I wanted to ask you, so I guess what then does the emergence of this pirate economy tell you about, how a sort of lasting solution to Somalia might be achieved?
Well, I think it tells us a couple of things. So one is the report talks about how pirate attacks are still increasing despite the fact that you've got quite an enormous armada, presumably to deter pirate attacks, there in the Gulf of Aden now. But what it also points out is that successful pirate attacks are decreasing. So the chances of a pirate actually succeeding in an attack has gone down. And I think from a political economy perspective, this suggests that the Somali piracy might just become decreasingly lucrative for these individuals, and we'll see it peter out due to market forces and this law of diminishing returns. Even if the international community does nothing other than continue to take steps to make sure that attacks fail. And it's interesting if you look at the kinds of recommendations the UN Security Council report makes versus, again, the Council on Foreign Relations report by Bronwyn, blanking on her last name. Anyway, the CFR report to which I was referring. Mm-hmm. The Security Council report emphasizes, a need to take renewed measures to prosecute and apprehend pirates, send them abroad to be tried and such. But the Council on Foreign Affairs report focuses more on what not to do instead of what to do, what else to do. What not to do would be do not use a policy of drone attacks or military strikes to take the battle onto land, right? Don't militarize counter-piracy efforts or attack their outposts because this could very well radicalize them. It could threaten civilians in those areas and create the very pirate-terrorist nexus that some security analysts fear, but which really isn't evident so far. And, I mean, what you might think about doing is, through the United Nations, is instead of going after pirates, go after illegal fishers. I mean, there's still quite a lot of illegal fishing that's going on in Somali waters. I think I read a statistic, like some $450 million in illicit catch per year, 800 illegal vessels in Somali waters at a given point in time. And of course, the Somalis don't have the Coast Guard or the Navy to police their waters effectively themselves. But suppose the UN Security Council passed a resolution asking member states to focus on that, it would also decrease the demand for piracy because they've set themselves up as presumably this response to illegal overfishing. So I think there are some ways that you can, again, adopt a position of neutrality and just allow market forces in the country to go to take their logical course without without necessarily going after individuals who are often seen as heroes in the local society.
Good. So maybe moving on. So other than this, Somalia report, which had made headlines, around the UN last week, for the past 2 weeks at the UN, there's been a meeting, the Commission on the Status of Women, and that meeting sort of was front and center. Heads of state, or not heads of state, but many foreign ministers attended, including our own Hillary Clinton. Meanwhile, across town, there was a big inaugural Women in the World conference put on by the Daily Beast, which I actually attended and found fascinating and inspiring and depressing and interesting all at the same time.
Sure.
And so it's a good opportunity, a good time to talk about global women's issues and gender equality. And I think you're probably more qualified to speak on that than I. So I'll let you sort of kick it off.
Okay, I'll start by just pushing back on that one. Why am I more qualified? It's not because I'm a woman, is it?
Well, yeah.
Oh, well, I don't agree with that at all. I think that, in fact, a progressive-minded, pro-feminist man is way better than a conservative or nationalist woman in a position of power. So I'll start by deconstructing that gender notion. But
all right.
But not to pick on you. I mean, the argument is actually that I have some expertise in gender issues. I teach a course on gender insecurity, so I can speak from that perspective more than from my perspective as a woman. And I'll just say that I love International Women's Day, not just because it's my husband's birthday, but also because suddenly you see this swath of news articles about women and gender issues that are often marginalized, I'm afraid, throughout the rest of the year. So The Economist, for example, had this big front page story on female infanticide in China and India and how it's changed the sex ratios and what are all the costs to society and to regional stability of this massive disproportion of young men in these South Asian countries. You had India, right, just passed the law on gender quotas, reserving 33% seats in the national parliament. So this story got a lot of press, partly because it coincided with International Women's Day. And I think that's fantastic. I think there needs to be much more attention generally in the news and in international organizations, certainly in the security establishment, about how attention to gender issues can really help governments and other institutions meet their policy goals, and also ways in which we can make these institutions more inclusive and more responsive to the entire population of the world, instead of just the half that tends to have power.
It's interesting because, behind the scenes at the UN, right now, in fact, there is an ongoing debate and discussion on how to make these issues more relevant sort of to the daily work of the UN, not just, a commission, not just a couple of meetings once or twice a year, but to make promoting these issues a core mission of the UN. So for example, right now there's a bureaucratic reshuffling actually is underway at the UN, and before sort of eyes glaze over, it's actually something that could have, a important and profound impact on how the UN and how member states approach these issues going forward. Essentially, there are 4 distinct entities at the UN that deal with gender issues, gender equality, women's issues, and how to deliver those issues and those services to the developing world. There are 4 sort of separate entities that kind of sometimes overlap. Sometimes there are gaps in what they can do, and there's a proposal underway to fold all of these 4 into one single entity, which is actually called the entity, the gender entity right now, to be led by an Undersecretary General. And that's sort of like the number 2 or 3 position at the UN, and there are Undersecretary Generals in charge of peacekeeping, in charge of humanitarian affairs, and this would be sort of the Undersecretary General for global women's issues. And the idea is to better streamline how the UN can promote these issues on a local level, particularly in the developing world. So this is all underway right now, but it's sort of facing kind of typical UN politicking when it comes to these things. This is a priority of a lot of the donor countries, a lot of the northern and western countries want to sort of make this the big reform this year. And there while sort of the General Assembly has said, we're going to do this, we want this to happen, they've been a little slow in actually implementing it because the developing world wants assurances on other sort of finance issues. So right now it's underway, it's slow. My guess is that this reform will take place by the time of the next World Summit in September, but it's certainly something to look out for.
And is your sense that this Undersecretary General will be heading an institution, will be the women's spokesperson at the table, or will he or she be sort of the gender spokesperson, which is much broader? I think it's an important distinction because gender and gender mainstreaming in institutions is really not only about getting women's voices heard or getting them more access. It's really about men and women and how they relate. It's about how men relate to other men. And it's about sort of bringing gender as a category of analysis into programming in ways that include attention to women's issues, but go far beyond that. So I wonder what your sense is of the scope of the idea, and also the risk that it will become sort of ghettoized in that particular body or office, rather than becoming mainstreamed throughout the UN system. And what do you see as the trade-offs?
Well,
there?
right. I think right now it's ghettoized between these four agencies, and it's seen as sort of something distinct. It's seen as something, say, the UN does, and not what the UN is. I'd say it's probably the same way. If you were to go back maybe 15 years ago, human rights was this sort of categorized part of what the UN does or is, but with Kofi Annan's sort of rise and Kofi Annan's tenure at the UN was marked by mainstreaming human rights. So now when people think of what the UN does around the world, human rights is a central element to that. And I think this is the first step in making gender issues a core UN mission, or women's. I think both gender and women's issues a core part of the UN's mission. It's making it it's sort of mainstreaming it into the UN, the way that human rights were mainstreamed into the UN about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years
Fabulous.
ago.
That would be my hope as well. I'll be interested to see how that process pans out over the next few months or a few years.
And I mean, it'll be interesting to see. There's a bit of a parlor game going on as to who might lead this new entity. It's part of it is subject to politics. It's obviously it's the Secretary General's ultimate decision to appoint someone, but obviously he wants to do this with wide consultation, make sure that the right person in the right role is satisfied. But it'll be interesting. It's sort of an interesting and kind of fun and hopeful thing to watch going on at the UN right now.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah. Another exciting thing happening, probably of most interest to the general public, and by general public I mean like the wide general public, the movie-going public and the television-watching public, are the UN's efforts. It's actually very specifically the Secretary General's efforts to get the UN talked about in Hollywood a bit more. You had an interesting panel discussion, you said, at the International Studies Association conference on Battlestar Galactica.
Yes, it was an exciting discussion.
So I will confess to have never seen Battlestar Galactica. I don't even know the premise of the show, but I do know that people at the UN like it, and apparently people at the International Studies Association like it. So I'll let you take it away.
A few of us geeks. I guess maybe I should explain the show. And I mean, the reason it came up in the context of the United Nations, and what I wanted to ask you about is the United Nations actually had the cast of the show come to a panel discussion on human rights and human security last year as the show was ending. It ran for 4 seasons, and this is the premise of the show is that humans began out in space somewhere. And they evolved. There were 12 colonies of humans, and they created a race of robots to be their slaves, and the robots turned on them and fought a war. Classic. So it's based on an old 70s show, but the reimagined series was a creation of the global war on terror, and it was very much a commentary on what do you do when you're faced with an enemy that wants to wipe you out, that can't be reasoned with necessarily. that is pursuing you across the galaxy, and that most of the humans get wiped out in the pilot episode. So it really is a genocide against humans. And there's a sort of a ragtag fleet of refugees that's led by this one, by the military establishment, the remaining Battlestar. And it's all about, sort of what are the limits of measures that they might take, both for national security. And human security in this context really means keeping alive these last 50,000 humans so that they can actually settle somewhere and restart civilization someday. But in the meantime, they have to deal with traitors within their midst. They have to the Cylons now look like humans, so they don't look like robots anymore the way they did in the old series. They've evolved, so they can infiltrate the fleet. You don't know if your friend is a Cylon. So there's all these questions about torture and human rights, national security ethics, civil-military relations, the boundaries of, civilian control over the military. Every single issue that has become prevalent in U.S. Foreign policy discourse and global society since the attacks of 9/11 is reflected in the show. And so I think that is the basis on which people at the UN appreciate the series, and the reason that the actors were brought in for this panel discussion on issues relevant to the UN community. My assumption being that it's part of a PR strategy at the UN, as you say, to try to get the word out to the public in a very entertaining way about what the UN is all about.
Yeah, it actually is. It's a very transparent PR strategy. I think that they have a name for it, like the Creative Coalition or Creative Outreach, like Creative Coalition Outreach. And Ban Ki-moon actually just before the Oscars was in Hollywood, gave a speech to a group at Hollywood and encouraged them to include the UN in more storylines and to talk about like all of the UN's good works and also what the UN does in the field in more of sort of in more of sort of Hollywood pictures. And interestingly enough, just this week, one of those storylines was included in Law and Order Special Victims Unit. Apparently, the story included rape in the Congo, and the UN was out and tried to, and also some sort of advocacy groups as well, did what they could to promote this show and get people talking about the terrible scourge of rape in the Congo. There have been other, although I must say that the Interpreter was, I think, the first movie that sort of was allowed to be filmed at the UN. And it was the first one that that really included the UN as a backdrop. Although the UN wasn't necessarily super central to the plot line, but it was the UN was almost a character in the movie in a way.
Yeah, you got a very opaque sense of UN procedures and such in that film.
And funny enough, Ban Ki-moon in his speech to Hollywood sort of cited the Constant Gardener as a good example of showing what the UN is doing in the field.
And so, this creative, what's it called?
It has a name. I'm probably butchering the name, but it's something like a creative outreach, right? Creative Coalition Outreach, something like that.
Yeah. Oh, Creative and Community Outreach Initiative, maybe?
Something like that, yeah.
They have, unlike women, I guess, their own Undersecretary General who does this work. And I guess I'm wondering, is it successful? Do you see over time, as a result of these initiatives, greater public engagement with the UN, greater awareness about what you do and what you don't do? What's your sense of the impact of these strategies?
I think it's probably too soon to tell because it's sort of a new thing. But there have been, if you look at one way in which sort of the UN very consciously engages celebrity is through their Goodwill Ambassadors and the Goodwill Ambassador program.
Yes.
Funny enough, just yesterday, Antonio Banderas
we have
was
a new
named
one.
as a Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Development Program to promote the Millennium Development Goals in Spanish-speaking countries. I think those are useful. Having people like Drew Barrymore support the World Food Program or George Clooney support UN peacekeeping are useful on two levels. One, it just kind of raises a general awareness of these things. But two, when you look specifically at UN humanitarian agencies, like the World Food Program or UNICEF. You know, these organizations depend on voluntary contributions to sustain themselves, unlike the regular UN, where members pay dues to join. You know, these humanitarian organizations just depend on donations. Most of their money comes from member states, but a not insignificant sum comes from foundations and individuals. So, you know, I think it helps to get the word out, and it helps, you know, frankly, probably to raise some money at the margins as well.
And do you have a sense that popular culture, that sort of narratives that you might see in a show like Battlestar Galactica, for example, also impact the United Nations as a community in helping them think through some of the ethical dilemmas, the kinds of debates that we see at the UN Security Council on the limits, the balance between human rights and global security, new definitions of humanitarian law in contexts where wars are not being fought in the same way anymore? One of the most interesting pieces of the Battlestar Galactica panel that I saw was when Edward Olmos, who plays the military general, Commander Adama, called out the UN. There's a great YouTube video of the speech, and he called them out for using race rhetoric and talking about human beings as if they could be divided into these categories, Hispanic and African and et cetera. And he said there's no Hispanic race. There's only the human race. And it was very profound and very sort of very surprising in that context, kind of critique, and also a very basic point that he made. And I found myself wondering to what extent a celebrity of his stature, speaking in that context, was going to have any impact whatsoever on discourse at the United Nations on something like race or ethnicity or gender. To what extent do you think that popular cultural artifacts like a show like that are actually also feeding back into policymakers thinking on human security issues?
I can't imagine very much. Also because, the UN is a global organization, and while, U.S. pop culture is probably most dominant, it doesn't, translate everywhere always. So it's hard, I don't know how many, I don't know how popular, say Battlestar Galactica is outside of the United States or outside of English-speaking countries. So it's hard to tell. In terms of using...
Yeah, that was just an example. It's more of a general question, sort of about the relationship between this military-industrial entertainment complex and global policy making. On the one hand, we want to bring people in, we want to sort of use that complex to help sell global policy to people. And on the other hand, I just wonder if there's a recursive effect as well in the way we think about things and what gets on the agenda. I don't know either.
It's funny because the more I think about it, the more it works that other way. So you have advocacy groups that want, rape in the Congo to be a storyline of an SVU unit. You have the UN working with, those groups and Law and Order to, maybe film some scenes at the UN because this is part of the storyline in order to get the word out about this, global issue. I don't know the extent to which it works, the other way. It's not something I'd actually, given much thought to. I'm sure there probably is some symbiosis, but I couldn't really put my finger on anything right now.
I don't know either. I just think it's a really interesting question.
No, it's
someone
something,
needs to write a book
certainly
on it.
something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So any sort of parting thoughts or topics or anything else you wanted to talk about?
I'm good. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's always exciting to engage, sort of get out of my academic headspace, thinking about what does human security mean, and talk about the nitty-gritty ways in which it's manifest around the world. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, and it helps, me sort of engage with on the academic level, which is always fun and interesting. So thank you very much, and we should do this again.
Many thanks.
All right.